Hi everyone, myself Navyatha working as Assistant Professor in the Department of Cybersecurity and Data Science in MLR Institute of Technology. Today I am going to discuss about the topic timestamp based protocols, and my overview of presentation includes what is timestamp based protocol and the working of timestamp based protocol. The name itself represents the protocol that is based on timestamps, that is when the transaction enters, then we can able to retrieve one unique value. That is what we called as timestamp. At that particular time, we can give one unique value. That we called as timestamp. Okay. And the working of timestamp based protocol with a simple example. So let us discuss about what is timestamp based protocol. It is an ordering protocol which is used to order the transactions based on their timestamps. Let us discuss this one. For example, let us consider two transactions T1 and T2. If T1 enters at 10 am, T1 enters at 10 am, right? And T2 enters at 10 am. Okay, the timestamp of, let us give one value. The timestamp of T1 is, for example, 100. Okay, let us give one unique value. Why? Because it has entered at particular time 10 o'clock. And let us give a unique value to T2 which is greater than T1. Why? Because it has entered recently. For recent transactions, we have to give the maximum value. Okay. So next, what is the point that you have to remember here? Older transactions must be completed first. Then only we have to complete the recent transactions which they have entered. Okay, older transactions, even though the value is less, that means we have to complete the older transactions first. By seeing these values only, we can able to guess whether this is a older value or the new recently entered operation or transaction. Okay. The order of transaction is nothing but the ascending order of the transaction creation. The priority of older transaction is higher. That's why it executes first. So the priority, whenever the transaction enters first, then that transaction will be executed first. Later on, the next transactions which have entered. Okay. To determine the timestamp of a transaction, this protocol uses system time or logical counter. To give one value, it uses system time or some logical counter. The log-based protocol is used to manage order between conflicting pairs among transactions at execution time. Previous sessions we have discussed log-based protocols, that is shared lock, exclusive lock and two-phase locking protocol, 2PL. Right. So in those protocols we used to manage the order between the conflicting pairs. What are the conflicting pairs here? Read, write, it is a conflicting pair. Write, read, it is a conflicting pair. And write, write, it is also a conflicting pair. But read, read is a conflicting pair? No. So in a transaction, if at all there is at least one write operation, then it will become a conflict pair. In read, read, there is no write operation. Okay. That means if at all we used to update the data only, then the database will become inconsistent. Right. That is the reason. So in previous protocols, so we used to manage the order between conflicting pairs at the execution time. But timestamp based protocol starts working as soon as the transaction is created. As soon as the transaction is created, it starts working. Let us assume that there are two transactions T1 and T2. Suppose T1 has entered the system at particular time 007 times. Okay. And T2 has entered at 009 times. For example, T1, T2. These are the two transactions. So it has entered at 007 and it has entered at 009 times. Okay. Then which will have the highest priority? Which has entered first? T1 has entered first. So T1 will have the highest priority to complete all the operations. Then we have to go for T2. Okay. So obviously T1 has the highest priority. Okay. What is a timestamp? What is a timestamp? Unique value assigned to every transaction. Unique value assigned to every transaction. That we called as here timestamp. What is the working? Here some of the formulas are there. By seeing this, we may have the doubt that how we can able to remember these kind of formulas. Okay, it's very simple. It's very simple. We need to do how many operations? Read operation, write operation, right? So this is for read operation, this is for write operation. Okay. So if a transaction want to do read operation, then we have to check what? The write timestamp. Why? Because read, write is the conflict pair. Okay. If a transaction wants to do read operation, then we have to check the write timestamp. And if we want to do write operation, then we have to check the read and write. Why? Because the conflicting pair for write operation is read and write also. Right? These three. See here, these three are conflicting pairs. Read, write, read and write. These three are conflicting pairs. So, if a transaction wants to do read operation, then we need to check for the write timestamp. Okay. If a transaction wants to do write operation, then we need to check for read and write. So, here if a transaction wants to do write operation, then we need to check for read and write. Okay. So, here what is this WTS is meant for? WTS is meant for write timestamp. Okay. And what is your TS of TI? This is timestamp of transaction 1. Timestamp of transaction 1. I means here whatever the transaction that you are going to do. Okay. Next, what is here RTS? RTS is meant for read timestamp. Read timestamp. And so what is this X? X is nothing but the data item that you are performing. For example, read timestamp of A. This is the data item. Read timestamp of B. Write timestamp of A. Okay. So, these are nothing but X is nothing but here the data item. And these are the formulas that we need to remember to do the working of a timestamp based protocol. And here let us discuss these things. So, if we want to do, if a transaction is performing read operation, then we need to check what? Write timestamp. So, if write timestamp of X is greater than timestamp of the particular transaction, then what we have to do? This will be rejected and this transaction is rollbacked. I will explain these steps with a simple example. Then you will get a very clear idea. Okay. So, if WTS of X is less than TS of TI, that means if write timestamp is less than or equal to timestamp of TI, then what we have to do? Then read operation is executed as it is and we have to update this read operation by using max function. Max of RTS of X, comma, TS of TI. This is what the formula. Okay, next, let us assume that if a transaction wants to perform write operation, transaction wants to perform write operation. What are the conflicting pairs for write? Read as well as write. So, we need to check these two. Right. So, here if RTS of X is greater than timestamp of TI, then operation gets rejected and rollbacked. If WTS of X is greater than TS of TI, then it's get rollbacked. Otherwise, it will execute. So, let us discuss these things with a simple why we need these kind of conflicts. Okay. Let us discuss this one. So, let us take two transactions T1 and T2. Okay. So, if T1 is performing read operation, T2 is performing write operation after T1. Okay. Even though it is a conflict, nothing will happen. Even though it is a conflict. Why? Because highest priority will be given to which transaction? The transaction that enters first. That means here, for example, the timestamp value is 100, the timestamp value is 200. Whichever the timestamp value is less, then that transaction can be considered as the older transaction. And if at all, if a transaction has highest value, then it can be considered as the new transaction that has entered. Okay. So, if at all we have a conflict pair, even though there is no problem, why? Because we used to give priority to the old transaction, R of A. Okay. Again, let us consider the same thing, T1, T2. Okay. Here, write of A, here read of A. Even though this is a conflict pair, then there will be no problem. Why? Because here we used to give the first priority to T1, then only T2. Okay. After committing this one only, we used to do T2. Okay. That is also no issues. And the third example, T1, T2, let us consider the two transactions. So what is next conflict pair? Right and right. Even though we have to update, this also doesn't contain any problem. Why? Because here we used to give the first priority to the T1. Okay. So the problem will arise whenever T2 wants to perform first. Okay. The problem will arise. So let us discuss this one. See, T1, T2. Let us take the two transactions, T1 and T2. Now, if T1 wants to read the data first, T2 wants to read the data, later on T1 wants to update or write the data. Here comes the problem. Why? Because, see here, this, for example, T2 has the value 100. Okay, it has read the value 100. Now, T1 reads the value from T2, okay, and it has been updated. For example, it has been updated. That means here what? Right means here we used to update the value in a database. It has the capacity to update also. Let us discuss, it has been updated the value as 200. 100 as 200. It has been updated. Okay. Then, see here, this is the older transaction, we used to give priority first, right? So, it has been committed. It has updated the value. It has been committed. Okay. Later on, this transaction failed. What happened? Fails. Then what will happen? So, we have updated the value which has read by this transaction. Okay. So, later on, this transaction fails. So, that we used to maintain what? Here, we have doesn't maintain the accurate data. That is what the problem. Okay. So, these kind of problem exist when T2 performs a read operation. Later on, T1, the older transaction, wants to retrieve the data from T2. Okay. Then these kind of conflicts will occur. Then we have to do rollback. So, these three steps will be mentioned here. Okay. The same conflict. Again, let us discuss one more example. So, T1, T2. If T1 wants to write the data, later on, if T2 wants to write the data or update the data, later on T1 wants to update it again. This is also a conflict. It must not allow. Okay. Why? Because if at all data has been updated here, okay, same, A has been updated 100. Okay. Later on again, T1 has updated as 200. Same problem. See here, whatever the data updated here will be lost. Why? Because we have to give first priority to the transaction T1. So, if at all it has been committed, then the value will be as 200. Then what about this value, updated value? Data will be lost, right? So, these are the some kind of conflicts. When will occur? If T2 wants to perform, right, initially the transactions, then T1 wants to perform from T2, then only the conflict will occur. This will be dealt in these steps. Okay. Let us discuss these things with a simple example. Before going to that, as I have represented, what are the three? See here, three conditions. TS of TI means timestamp of transaction. I means here transaction 1 or 2 or 3 like that. So, TS of TI denotes the timestamp of the transaction of that particular transaction. Here I is the subscript that is represents from T1 or T2 or 3. Okay, whatever the transactions are there. Next, what is RTS here? Read timestamp. What is X here? The data item. Okay, here X can be A or B or C, whatever the data item that you are going to take in the example. Okay, so what is here? RTS read timestamp denotes the read timestamp of data item X, and it is the largest latest timestamp of any transaction that executed read of X successfully. Okay, what is the read timestamp here? The largest latest read timestamp that will be taken, that has been represented for RTS of X. What is WTS of X? Denotes the write timestamp of data item X. Write timestamp of data item X, and it is the largest latest timestamp value of any transaction that executed write of X successfully. So let us deal these three with a simple example to understand T1, T2. Okay, and let us take T3 also. So here, for example, read of A, write of A, read of B, write of B. This is the first one, this is the second step, this is the third step. That means here fourth step. That means after one by one the transaction entered. So T1, this has been entered first, the timestamp value will be 100. Let us for suppose the timestamp value will be 200 and the timestamp value will be 300. Why? Because so T1 entered first, T2 entered next, T3 entered next. Okay. So what is the read timestamp of A? What is the read timestamp of A? Read timestamp means what here? See, read transaction is there in T1 and read transaction is there in T3. So what is the RTS of A here? RTS of A means here the largest timestamp. Largest means here whatever the recent transaction. Okay, so that has been read, that one. RTS of A. Okay, for example, not B, here let us take A. Okay, so what is the largest timestamp? First, the timestamp for R of A is 100. Later on, R of A is there anywhere? Yes, here. So what is the value that we have to represent here? 300, not 100, that is 300. Why? Because we have to represent the latest timestamp value. So this is what the latest one that has read the value A. That is why read timestamp of A. Okay. Next, in the same manner, what is the latest timestamp of B here? What is the latest timestamp of B? For example, here let us take W of B. Okay, this is the fourth one, this is the fifth one. Okay, so what is the WTS of B here? WTS of B means latest value, latest timestamp value of write operation of B. So W of B is there in T1. Later on, any value, any transaction is there. Right, here it is there. What is the transaction value here? Timestamp value 300. This is also 300. So in this way, we have to represent the timestamp values RTS and WTS. So RTS is meant for picking the largest timestamp value. WTS meant for picking the largest timestamp value of any transaction. Okay. So now let us discuss with the formulas with a simple example. Okay. Let us consider TS of T1. That means timestamp of T1 is what? 100. Timestamp of T2 is nothing but 200. Timestamp of 3 is nothing but 300. Okay. So in T1, what we are performing? Read operation. We are performing read operation. So if at all we are performing read operation, what we need to check with the formula? Whenever transaction Ti means the first transaction T1 is used to perform read operation. Okay. So here X, in place of X, there in the example I have kept A. Okay. Whatever the data item is kept in the example, you can replace with the data item here. Okay. So here the transaction T1 is performing read operation. Then what we need to check? Write timestamp of A. Write timestamp of A. Initially all the timestamps here. Initially all the timestamps. See here RTS and WT, read timestamp and write timestamp for A, B, C. Why? Because here we have taken how many variables? How many variables? Here we have 3 variables. Right. So those 3 variables. Here we have to represent it. All the variables A, B, C and the timestamp values for those variables. Initially we used to take it as 0. Okay. So RTS of A. RTS of A initially what? It is 0. Okay. So now See, and WTS of A. What is WTS of A? It is also 0. What we need to check here, we are doing in transaction T1, we are doing what? Read operation. Then we need to check the write conflict, right? So WTS of A is greater than TS of TI. That is what the formula there. WTS of A is greater than TS of TI. What is this TI? TI means here the transaction T1. Right. So, here what we have to write, WTS of A. What is WTS of A value? 0 is greater than timestamp of T1. What is the timestamp of T1? See, timestamp of T1, T2, T3. These are the 3 types of transactions. Timestamp of T1 100, 200, 300. What is the timestamp of T1 here? 100. So, is 0 greater than 100? False. Right. So, if at all it is false, then what we have to do? See in this step. So, if at all it is false, then what we have to do? The operation gets rejected and TI is rolled back. That means if at all this condition is true, then operation gets rejected. If at all it is false, then we have to go for the second step. Else. Okay. So, what is the second step here? RTS of A is equal to max of 0, 100. What is this one? We need to update read timestamp of A. Read timestamp of A with the maximum of, what is this 0, 100? 0, 100 is nothing but here, see, 0, 100 is nothing but read timestamp of X, timestamp of TI. That means here RTS of A will be represented as max of RTS of A, timestamp of T1. This is the formula. Okay. So, RTS of A is equal to this will be updated. The read timestamp will be updated with this particular value. Maximum of RTS of A, TS of T1. What is the maximum of RTS of A means initially 0. Right. What is the TS of T1? 100. What is the maximum value of 0 and 100? 100. So, RTS of A will be represented with 100. So, here this will be replaced with what? 100. RTS of A will be replaced with 100. Okay. So, now let us consider the second transaction. What is the second transaction? Read. That too for T2. Okay. Read transaction, that too for T2. So, here let us consider for read transaction, we need to check WTS. Right. The first step. So, see here WTS of B is greater than TS of T2. Why? Because this transaction, this W, whatever the operation that we are performing will be in transaction T2. That is why here we have taken T2. Okay. So, this R of B belongs to T2. That is why here we are checking write timestamp. Why? Because we are doing read operation. Okay. So, what is the formula? WTS of B is greater than TS of T2. What is WTS of B here? See, WTS of B. Initially, WTS of B is nothing but WTS of B 0. Okay. So, 0. Here this is 0 is greater than TS of T2. Timestamp of T2. What is the timestamp of T2 here? 200. Okay. Is 0 greater than 200? No. Then we need to update the value. Second, else condition. Okay. What is that one? Set RTS of B is equal to maximum value of this one and 200. Okay. So, what is the maximum value of 0 and 200? What is the maximum value of these two? 200. So, this will be updated as 200. RTS of B will be updated as 200 now. Okay. Now, let us consider the third one. What is the third transaction? Here, W of C, write transaction. For write transaction, we need to check two conflicts, read operation and write operation also. So what is the formula here? See here, for write transaction, we are performing write transaction on C. Okay, that too on T1. So we need to check RTS of C is greater than TS of T1. Okay, see what we need to check, RTS of C is greater than TS of T1. That formula will be checked. Again, WTS of C is greater than TS of T1. These two will be checked first. Okay, so RTS of C is greater than TS of T1. What is RTS of C here? RTS of C is 0 initially. Okay, 0 is greater than TS of T1. What is the timestamp of T1? TS means timestamp. Timestamp of T1 is 100. So 0 greater than 100? No. Next, condition false. So execute W of C and you have to update WTS value. What is the right timestamp value? TS of T1. See here, right timestamp value will be updated. See, the operation gets rejected if at all. See, otherwise execute the right operation and right timestamp will be what? TS of the timestamp of T1. Why? Because that right operation is in T1. So it will be updated. So the value will become 100. What is WTS of C? WTS of C will become here 100. So in this manner, we used to perform all the formulas here. The first one, second one, third one. And the next operation, which operation we need to take? Fourth one, this operation. Read operation on B. If at all we are taking read operation, what we need to check? WTS. Okay. WTS of B. Okay. So here WTS of B is greater than TS of T3. Why? Because see here R of B in which transaction? T3 transaction. So we need to check here T3. TS of timestamp of 3T. So what is your WTS of B? WTS of B is 0. WTS of B is 0. So 0 is greater than 300, condition false. Then what we have to? We need to update the value. We need to update the value. Here RTS of B is equal to maximum of 200 of between 200 and 300. So on these two values, which value is greater? 300 is value. So this will be updated. RTS of B will now updated as 300. Okay, will now update as the latest value, that is 300. Next, in the same manner, we used to check for all the operations in the given example. In this way, the working of timestamp based protocol will be dealt. Okay. So in this manner, we have to update all the timestamps. Okay. So what we have discussed in this section? So here we used to deal with timestamp based protocol. So in previously we have discussed about log based protocol. This is one of the protocols. So it will represent whenever the transaction enters, it starts working. And the older transactions will have the highest priority to complete. And even though we have what conflicts between the transactions. So based upon these timestamps, we used to remove those conflicts also. Thank you.